Welcome, everyone, to the first Gaslit Nation book club, where we're going to be discussing two extraordinary books that captured a moment in time that is eerily, horribly similar to today. And they were Albert Camus' The Stranger and Viktor Frankl's Man's Search for Meaning. The Stranger, of course, is a novel, and Man's Search for Meaning is a Holocaust memoir written by Viktor Frankl, who was a neurologist, a psychologist, who was a Jewish man who was arrested and sent to the concentration camps. He went through a series of different camps. He arrived to Auschwitz with his life's work in his pocket. And that was his development of observations in what gave life meaning. It's important to note that the interwar period, the 1930s, that was a time of massive interest in psychology. One of the superstars of the day was Sigmund Freud, who was groundbreaking in his work in furthering psychoanalysis. You had all the big celebrities, all the big journalists, intellectuals of the day going to Freud. Dorothy Thompson, the Antifa journalist who was married to Sinclair Lewis, who wrote It Can't Happen Here. You've heard me on the show maybe over the years talk about that power couple, namely how Dorothy Thompson destroyed the Elon Musks of the day with the power of the pen as a strident journalist with a brilliant column called On the Record in the Herald Tribune. So she had Freud on speed dial. And so this was a very exciting time for humanity, especially many among the elite who were learning to get in touch with themselves, digging deep in those childhood wounds. And that was part of a larger revolution of the mind that had been growing for some time. And one could even argue laid the groundwork for the big new age hippie movement of the 1970s, of hair, let the sun shine. Because what does the sun do? It shines its light on all those buried childhood wounds and so on. And you had such interest in this field that even Hitler's own mother was found by journalists, and they wanted to interview Hitler's mother to understand from a Freudian perspective from the woman who raised Hitler and what she thought of him and what they could glean about Hitler's own childhood and what his pleasure instincts might be as a dictator. So it was a time of that happening. And Viktor Frankl came along, and he was more interested in coming up with a new school that went against Freud and was more looking at, well, what is life? What gives life meaning? And when he arrives to Auschwitz, he's stripped naked and he's given the clothes of another inmate who has just been killed in the gas chambers. And he finds a Jewish prayer in that man's pocket. And that leads him to sort of self-examine as well as examine the other inmates around him in understanding what power do I have in an overwhelming crisis that makes me feel unimaginably powerless. And what he came out of that horrible experience with was that even when we're stripped of everything, we can make our own meaning, and that itself has power. And in discussing that, he describes inmates who died a death of dignity, who died happy. Obviously, we're talking about real lives here. We're talking about lives of people generations of families that were destroyed in the Holocaust. So I do feel a little uncomfortable discussing it because it's not like a self-help book that we're discussing. We're discussing a Holocaust memoir of a massive genocide and one of history's worst tragedies. But taken from this shows the tendency of life to be defiant, even in the face of brutal evil. And that's what we see here again and again in this stunning memoir that if you haven't had a chance to read it, absolutely read it. And the reason why we bring in Camus in this discussion and hold these two books together, because Viktor Frankl is writing from the perspective of one of the victims of the Holocaust, and Albert Camus is writing from the perspective of occupied France. He was in the resistance when he wrote The Stranger. And so he represents the side of the people doing what they could with the power they had, as overwhelming as the crisis was for them, to fight against these Nazis, to resist these Nazis, to chip away at their power wherever they were with whatever they had. And Camus, being a writer, he fought back brilliantly with the power of the pen. And some might feel like, well, that's meaningless. What can the power of the pen do against Nazi tanks and Nazi concentration camps? And it's important to remember that Camus' The Stranger was part of much larger works, including others I've talked about here on the show. He wrote a great series of articles for a resistance newspaper called Letter to a German Friend, where he was smack talking the Germans by saying, you may be winning because we're under occupation right now, but you're ultimately going to lose because your arguments for starting this war in the first place are inherently weak, and you're not as smart as you think you are. And we're actually much smarter than you, and therefore much stronger than you, because we have collective power on our side, because we have truth on our side, and the truth always wins. And it's a beautiful series of essays that apply to today, apply to conversations we could be having today against the Russians, against Trump and Musk, because it's true. These idiots are going to buckle underneath their own idiocracy. They're not as smart as they think they are. And we're seeing cracks of that right now with how Musk is being defied by several different government agencies telling their people, ignore the email, ignore the bullshit that Musk is making you do, right? We're just at the start of that. And you see Ukraine and the EU united in being defiant against Trump and Russia, united against the free world. So I have so much more to say along those threads, but the reason why we're reading these two books is because they have lessons for us today. And one of the most important lessons that you see in both The Stranger and Man's Search for Meaning is this. And these words are spelled out in Man's Search for Meaning, where Viktor Frankl writes, live your thoughts, live your thoughts. So what he saw again and again was people's inner worlds coming out into their outer world. They had to go in so deep because of the hell that they were in. And so they found their inner strength. Who else said that? Albert Camus. Albert Camus famously said, in the time of winter, I found inside me an eternal spring, an eternal summer. And live your thoughts, as Viktor Frankl wrote in A Man's Search for Meaning, we see that in the protagonist in The Stranger. He's just a man going about his business, doing some wrong, doing some right. And in a heated moment, he kills another man on a beach. And it becomes a sensational trial. And he's met by a priest while on death row. And the priest is losing his mind, trying to get the protagonist to confess to God, to make things right with God. But the man is not a believer. The protagonist just simply says, I'm just a human being trying to live my life. And I think all of you are being absurd by seeing things in my story that are simply not there. And I'm being put through this absurd trial. And why are you forcing me to believe in something I simply don't believe in? I'm not a good person. I'm not a bad person. I'm just a person. Leave me alone. And so the protagonist has the entire justice system and the entire church and the eye of the public on him. And he's being completely cornered to profess something that he simply does not believe in. And he's just going about his business. And he continues that. He's living his thoughts. And The Stranger, while it wasn't censored by the Nazis, it was written and printed by Camus. It is published in France during the occupation. It wasn't censored straight out, but it did have a limited run of copies to avoid it becoming a bestseller by selling too many copies, right? That's how much the publisher believed in it, that they wanted to protect the book by limiting its release so it wouldn't become too big to put a target on the head of Camus and others involved in that publication. So again, just to wrap this up, the big meaning to take from The Stranger and Man's Search for Meaning is live your thoughts, live your thoughts. In human history, we can't guarantee that there's certain patterns, that things are going to happen, but history does have a tendency to rhyme. And that rhyme includes, if you look at, for instance, again, as we've talked about in the past in the show, the age of Joan of Arc. Right? One could argue that Joan of Arc was the first witch trial of Europe. It was a time of the Black Plague destroying half of Europe. And because of the Black Plague, you had a labor shortage. So workers could demand greater rights. That meant women could become workers and they could rise up in society and have a greater voice. That dark time of the Black Plague completely shifted Europe. And there's so much death and destruction and war, the 100 Years' War between England and France, that people turned away from institutions, from the church, to explain themselves, to explain their lives, to explain society. And as a result, they turned inward. What happened following this period? The Renaissance, this wonderful, bright age of interest in human potential, flourished out of all of this darkness. And it was this philosophy, essentially, of live your thoughts, live your thoughts. People were turning inward in a time of crisis. Universities were being built and expanding during this time. More theology was growing, driving the growth of these universities, because people were turning to spirituality to explain themselves, to go inward, to begin within. And that's really where these two books unite as well. It's about begin within, know who you are, live your thoughts. We are now in a time of crisis. It's not just another chapter of fascism that has been here since the start of America, with slavery, with the genocide of Native Americans. It's not, I know people are saying this is America, it's always been America. That's absolutely true. But this is something darker, because the fascists we're up against are united globally with technology the world has never had to face before. And that includes, of course, AI. And then on top of that, you have the climate crisis, which is making everything unpredictable. And you're going to have mass destruction with the fires, with the floods and other things. And who's going to be there to help those people, to save them, to support them if you have the US government breaking down? It's probably the darkest chapter that humanity has ever had to face. And we're going through it now. You're going to see a very natural, human, understandable response where people are going to do what they've done throughout history. And that is they're going to turn within. They don't have institutions to rely on. The unlucky ones who don't have the protection around them might fall into cults. We've had a couple cult experts on this show over the years. They've said, this is cult season now. The times we're in are so chaotic that it does make people more vulnerable, including on social media with the algorithms, pumping you, driving you into certain directions. People are more vulnerable now to fall into the rabbit hole of a cult. But at the same time, the flip side of that is that people are turning inward and they're trusting their own eyes and ears. They're developing their intuition. They feel like, okay, everything's over now. What do I live for? Who am I? And that's ultimately what Viktor Frankl was advocating for. He's like, life isn't about pleasure. Life is not about avoiding pain. Life is about making meaning, like bloom where you're planted, like find the meaning where you are, build the meaning where you are. That's where your power lies. Creating meaning in a situation that seems absolutely hopeless is what is going to ultimately give you your power back in that situation. I am reminded of that with the war in Ukraine. There is a famous story that I was just reflecting on and reading these two books on a Ukrainian soldier, a prisoner of war, who was standing in a forest and he was facing a firing squad of Russians. And his final words were, Slava Ukraini, glory to Ukraine. And they gunned him down. And that man became a hero across Ukraine because he's standing there smoking a cigarette, defiant look in his eye, as though he's just standing around, like he does not look like a man on the verge of death. He looks incredibly dignified and strong. I believe there's even like a statue made to him, or like there's talk of one being made to him, and all sorts of artwork. And he became this fierce symbol of resistance for Ukrainians, even though he was brutally gunned down. And this was a war crime. But it was that moment of agency that he took back in that moment that gave so much strength and courage and resolve to Ukrainians everywhere. So we're seeing all the dynamics that Viktor Frankl described playing out now in the worst of circumstances. And that's what we have to keep in mind in going forward for ourselves, for our communities. It is fascist weather out there for the foreseeable future. I cannot tell you when the end to this will be. I hope it is in our lifetime. I really hope it is. But we can't think in those terms anymore, because that, as Viktor Frankl described in his memoir, that's actually horrible to think, oh, the midterms will come along and we'll get them. 2028 will come along and we'll get them. We cannot think in those terms anymore. Why? Because, as Viktor Frankl writes in the memoir, that is what will crush you. That is like a horrible false sense of optimism. And he said the optimists are just as bad as the pessimists. They're both nihilists because they put their faith in the wrong things. And so the only thing you can have faith in anymore in this time of uncertainty is your own inner light that's connected to my inner light and all of our inner lights. And it's finding that meaning where you are is so essential. We need that now from you more than ever. And that's not a self-help thing. That is literally survival for all of us right now, collectively, to do something instead of nothing. Think of that woman that was just dragged out of that town hall in Idaho by 3 men, and a sheriff is threatening her with arrest. How sickening was that? People I know lost sleep over that. That woman has now raised around $100,000 on GoFundMe, money that she can use to lawyer up to go after those men. But she now has a massive, massive support network because so many people saw that, felt sick to their stomachs, and decided to live their thoughts, to make some meaning out of this horrible situation. And now look, she's got a war chest now. She deserves one. And so things are going to shift that way. That's the path forward for all of us, is to begin within, find your meaning, and take it seriously, because we need that from you now more than ever.